Welcome to another Speaker's Corner. This is number 50 in our ongoing series. Having attended an ANZAC Day event somewhere in the world for the past 28 years, Andrew Johnston is bringing this special commemoration to the Villa Vie Odyssey in a talk tonight and a service tomorrow morning. Help me welcome Commander Andrew Johnston, Royal Australian Navy retired, to talk about the history and importance of ANZAC Day.
Thank you very much, Kev. Each year, on the 25th of April, all over the world, Australians and New Zealanders join together to remember those servicemen and women who have died or suffered in the great tragedy of war. Tomorrow morning, scheduled for 10 a.m, we will conduct a remembrance service here in the Coral Lounge to remember the 110th anniversary of the ANZAC landings at Gallipoli in 1915. Similar to the US Memorial Day, this is not a glorification of war, but a simple honouring of their memory. I hope to see you there tomorrow. Having served for over 28 years in the Royal Australian Navy, I've attended an ANZAC Day event somewhere in the world every year. I've been fortunate to speak, coordinate, and have witnessed dozens of dawn services, marches, and remembrance services. But I thought it is important to provide a background of ANZAC Day for my fellow residents to understand what's happening tomorrow. In this presentation, we'll first delve into the historical background of ANZAC Day, including its origins and significance, the Gallipoli campaign, and the role of Australian and New Zealand forces. Next, we will explore the various traditions that honour this day. We will also look at symbols associated with ANZAC Day and conclude with its impact and legacy. But I don't think there's any way I can start an historical background of ANZAC Day without a history lesson to begin with. The causes of World War I included the rise of Germany and the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which disturbed the long-standing balance of power in Europe. Rising economic competition between nations, driven by industrialisation and imperialism, added to those tensions. Growing tensions between the great powers and in the Balkans reached a breaking point when on June the 28th, 1914, a Bosnian Serb assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, and they declared war on the 28th of July. After Russia mobilised in Serbia's defence, Germany declared war on Russia and France, who had an alliance. The United Kingdom entered into the war after Germany invaded Belgium, and the Ottomans joined the Central Powers in November of 1914. Germany's strategy in 1914 was to quickly defeat France, then transfer its forces to the east. But its advances were halted in September, and by the end of the year, the Western Front consisted of a near continuous line of trenches from the English Channel right through to Switzerland. The Eastern Front was more dynamic, but neither side gained a decisive advantage despite costly offensives. Later, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania and Greece joined in the war from 1915 onward. In early continuous line of trenches from the English Channel right through to Switzerland. The Eastern Front was more dynamic, but neither side gained a decisive advantage despite costly offensives. Later, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania and Greece joined in the war from 1915 onward. In early November 1914, the Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed V, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire consisted of a geography of what are the modern-day countries of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Israel, Iraq, Lebanon and Jordan. With the Ottomans entering the war, this changed the strategic situation, especially in the Middle East, where Ottoman forces now posed a direct threat to the Suez Canal, an important British shipping lane between Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the globe, the newly formed nations of Australia and New Zealand were coming to terms with their place in the world order. Australia's Federation of Colonial States was just over 10 years old, and the combining of their colonial navies and army units was still being organised. In 1907, New Zealand transitioned from a British colony to a dominion within the British Empire. This was a significant symbolic step towards self-governance, although the United Kingdom still controlled New Zealand's external affairs. Both fledgling nations' power was still retained with the British Commonwealth, a thing that can be seen in the common element of both nations' flags. So almost immediately that Great Britain declared war on Germany and the Central Powers, Australia and New Zealand also declared war. Recruitment for young, fit men to head overseas to do their duty was quick to capture those looking for the great adventure. Training camps were set up around Australia and New Zealand to train these young volunteers in the basics of infantry and mounted warfare. Some of these training programs lasted a month. Of the eligible male population aged 18 to 44, 39%, over 400,000 Australians enlisted for service in the First World War. In 1914 alone, 52,000 joined the fight. The bulk of them formed the Australian Imperial Force, or the AIF. In New Zealand, it was claimed that over 120,000 men, more than half the country's men of military age, and 1/9 of the total population had been mobilised, and over 100,000 would serve overseas in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Both countries' fighting forces sailed in November 1914, bound for England to join the fighting in Europe. The British authorities, however, decided to offload the Australian and New Zealand Expeditionary Force in Egypt to complete their training and to bolster the British forces guarding the Suez Canal. In February 1915, elements of these forces helped to fight off an Ottoman raid that kept the canal open. The forces' wait in Egypt ended in early April 1915, when both were transported to the Greek island of Lemnos to prepare for the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The peninsula itself was important because it guarded the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, a strategic waterway leading to the Sea of Marmara and via the Bosphorus to the Black Sea. The Allied plan was to break through the straits, capture the Ottoman capital at Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Access to the straits and to the Sea of Marmara would also provide the Allies with a supply line to Russia and open up new areas in which to attack the Central Powers. Following the failure of the British and French warships to force the straits, the Allies dispatched the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. Australians and New Zealanders made up nearly half of the MEF's 75,000 troops. The rest were from Great Britain and Ireland, France, India and Newfoundland. The British 29th Division would land south at Cape Helles, and the ANZACs would land at what became known as ANZAC Cove, this part of Gallipoli. The plan was that whilst the British 29th held the majority of the expected Turkish forces, the ANZACs would break through on the Saribia Range to close off the peninsula. This would prevent any of the Turks from escaping and also to block reinforcements. This would then allow the British to come up to destroy any of the naval defences that would then allow the great warships to enter the Sea of Marmara. At first light on the morning of the 25th of April, the men of the Anzacs was rowed or towed ashore in makeshift whalers. 16,000 Anzacs at the first push. But expecting there to be a gentle slope of sand on which they had trained, what they faced was a brutal climb up sheer-sided cliffs. The terrain offered no cover, and the Turkish soldiers, well-trained and battle-hardened, entrenched, rained down a relentless barrage. Scrambling just to get cover, many did not make it off the beach, and on this first day, almost 2,000 Anzacs were lost. After a successful push inland, the battle wavered back and forth, and eventually settled into the usual trench warfare, with both sides some 100 metres apart in places. Here, the campaign bogged down for the next 8 months, with little movement of the lines despite desperate bayonet charges across no man's land by both sides. There were subsequent reinforcements from Australia and New Zealand, and I'd like to make mention of one of those brave men, Private Archie Augustus Self, service number 1594. He enlisted in April 1915. This is the embarkation roll where his name is inscribed as he boarded the transport ship Themistocles in May 1915 to reinforce the first Anzacs. And these are his medals. Archie survived the war and returned home, which is quite fortunate because much later, in 1945, his daughter was born, one of our proud Odyssey residents, Lynn Griffin.
Wow!
We are honoured to have her here to represent the first Anzacs. Whilst there are many that looked upon the Gallipoli campaign as a failure, with mounting casualties of 87,000 Ottoman Turks, 44,000 men from France and the British Empire, including 8,500 Australians and 2,800 New Zealanders, about 1/6 of those who served on Gallipoli died on that ground. What the campaign did prove was that Australia and New Zealand were becoming their own distinct nations, even as they fought on the other side of the world in the name of the British Empire. There are two important aspects that set this campaign aside. This was the first major fight of Australian and New Zealanders who showed their outstanding courage and resilience, facing harsh conditions and fierce opposition during the campaign. In the Commonwealth Forces, the highest honour that can be bestowed on a soldier, 9 Australians were awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery during Gallipoli. But for me, the most important aspect of this campaign was the withdrawal. At one stage, over 175,000 Allied troops were fighting in Gallipoli. But after 8 months of fierce fighting, the decision was made to withdraw all Allied troops from the peninsula. This could have, and often does, result in a rout, and can significantly increase the casualties. The first estimate made by the War Office in London was that the Allies would lose at least half their forces in any evacuation. However, with good planning and ingenuity, and this slide shows what is called a drip rifle, where water is entered into this top can and a hole made that drops into the bottom can, which is connected to the trigger on the rifle. This delayed action would set the rifle to fire some many hours after the troops left the trenches. Other designs of ingenuity, like sandbags that had holes punched in them to allow the sand run out, that were connected to the large howitzer guns, or donkeys that had bayonets fixed to their saddle to walk backwards and forwards through the trenches, indicated to the Turkish forces that the Allies were still there some many days after they left. What turned out was almost a miracle. Pinned down in the trenches and tunnels, the final 35,000 men slowly made their way under cover of darkness to waiting blacked out boats and silently slid back to the transport ships. Conducted over 3 nights, these 35,000 men were evacuated with no casualties. The landing at Gallipoli was already etched to the minds of many people, while the Gallipoli camp was still being fought. It became a defining moment in Australia's and New Zealand's history. The first ANZAC Day services were held in 1916, whilst the nations were still at war. ANZAC troops, after resting and reinforcement, were sent to Europe, where they took part in fighting on the Western Front from 1916, that fighting taking place in France and Belgium. This first ANZAC Day parade was held in Sydney in 1916 to honour those forces. But I'd like to tell you another story of one of those ANZACs. And normally on these days, we talk about men who served overseas and generally didn't come back. For a change, I'd like to talk about a lady who served overseas and came back home to do further good work. This is a story of Sister Madge Holdsworth, who was a nurse born in Sydney in 1883. Details of her early life are a bit of a mystery, but we know she had at least one sibling and that she lived with her parents in Sydney, Australia, where she trained as a nurse. Then came the war, and in 1914 Madge enlisted as a staff nurse with the 2nd General Hospital Special Reinforcements, and she left Australia on the 12th of July 1915. Nursing provided a major opportunity for Australian women to actively participate in the war. Some 3,000 Australian nurses served as part of the Australian Army Nursing Service in places as diverse as Egypt, England, France, Gallipoli, Italy, Burma, Salonika and India. Many worked in British hospitals or British Army nursing units, and later with Australian units as well as hospital ships. It was not practical for Australian nurses to treat only Australians, so they treated and nursed the wounded of many nations, including the enemy. They proved to be energetic, resilient and hard-working in extremely difficult circumstances. These challenges included poor facilities, lack of staff, disease, harsh climate and large numbers of wounded and traumatised patients. Language difficulties for some patients was another problem that they had to quickly overcome. Madge spent 3.5 years serving in Egypt, France and England, and her papers indicated she encountered many of the problems previously mentioned, including being quite seriously ill on several occasions. She must have done a fine job. After her patients, though, she was promoted to sister in October 1918, a month before the end of the war. She returned to Australia and later settled in Rabaul in Papua New Guinea, only to have to be evacuated when the Japanese attacked in 1942. Not a lot of luck. Australian and New Zealand men and women were again called upon during the Second World War, with some men fighting in North Africa, Greece, Middle East, Syria, and through the Pacific Campaign. Australia played a significant role in the North African campaign, particularly with the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, who were engaged in numerous battles, including Operation Compass and the Siege of Tobruk and the Battle of El Alamein. Australia and New Zealand's navies saw action in the Pacific Campaign and in the protection of Atlantic convoys. And both navies provided men and aircraft for various campaigns, air campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Years later, about 17,000 Australians served in Korea between 1950 and 1953, the casualties numbering 339 dead. New Zealand provided 6,000 men with a total of 45 casualties. And again, both nations answered the call for international involvement in Vietnam. In the Vietnam War, over 60,000 Australians serving in various roles. Australia suffered 523 deaths and almost 2,400 wounded. New Zealand supplied over 3,000 men and women in various roles and unfortunately suffered 37 casualties. And Australia and New Zealand have supplied the men, women and service dogs to many United Nations operations around the world since 1947. The ANZACs on Gallipoli helped shape the Australian story. Once used to refer to those who fought only in the First World War, as time has passed, the meaning of ANZAC has changed. and now expresses the characteristics that are seen as important to Australians and New Zealanders and those serving the defence forces of each country, including courage, endurance, equality and mateship. While the relevance of the ANZAC legend in today's multicultural society may at times be debated, there is little doubt that these characteristics and the meaning of ANZAC will always remain. ANZAC Day is marked by various commemorative events and traditions that bring people together to remember those who served and sacrificed. Early in the Second World War, ANZAC Day acknowledged a new generation of service personnel and celebrated Allied victories. Today, ANZAC Day also honours those who have served through recent conflicts and on peacekeeping missions. The day reflects the diversity of modern military operations as young veterans join with veterans of earlier wars connected by the experience of service. Now a tradition 110 years old, ANZAC Day has become Australia and New Zealand's most important secular occasion. The dawn service is a solemn ritual that takes place at dawn on ANZAC Day, symbolising the time when the ANZAC troops landed at Gallipoli. A service normally includes prayers, hymns and moments of silence, allowing participants to reflect on the sacrifices made. This photo of the dawn service at the 100th anniversary in Gallipoli in 2015, where over 100,000 Australians and New Zealanders attended, and Lynn can tell you more about that. Throughout Australia and New Zealand, there are many ANZAC Day marches in most principal capital cities and smaller towns. I had the honour of leading this 300-strong Navy contingent at the 2023 ANZAC Day March in Darwin. A riderless horse, often referred to as a lone charger, is a significant symbol used in those ANZAC Day parades and other memorial events to commemorate fallen soldiers, particularly those from cavalry or mounted troops. This horse, with its boots reversed in the stirrups and a stripped saddle, symbolises a mounted warrior who has died in battle. But every event has its symbols and its representation. The red poppy is widely recognised as a symbol of remembrance in many countries, including Australia and New Zealand. It signifies the blood shed by soldiers during war and is often worn on ANZAC Day. During the spring offensive in the Western Front in Europe, poppies were the only flowers that had survived the carnage, and they littered many of the battlefields. Rosemary is also a particular significance for Australians, as it was found growing wild on the Gallipoli Peninsula. This herb is often worn on ANZAC Day in memory of the fallen. One thing you will find in every town, city and provincial part of Australia and New Zealand is a memorial to our soldiers fallen. These structures serve as a physical representation of the sacrifices made and have become focal points for remembrance, allowing communities to gather and pay tribute to those who served. Australia Day has become a national day of remembrance in both Australia and New Zealand, with ceremonies and events reflecting the pride and respect felt by citizens for those who served. In all of my days, there was only one or two occasions that I got to march in a capital city, and the most moving thing for me was seeing people in the street with handwritten signs saying thank you for your service. It was incredibly touching for us who were marching. Some hours earlier, Australia and New Zealand celebrated their ANZAC Day, and the Australian opposition leader, Mr. Peter Dutton, gave a moving tribute at the dawn service in Canberra. I'd like to quote that just to give you a sense of where we're driving towards. He said, "Behind every name on an honour roll, memorial or grave is a person. Behind each person is a story, and behind each story is a family. By learning about that person, the story and the family behind a name, especially through diary entries and family tributes in newspapers, we can appreciate the magnitude of sacrifice and loss. Our soldiers, sailors and airmen left behind loved ones, livelihoods and lives of aspiration. There was valour in every act of service, but there was tragedy too, in every life lost so quickly or in agony on the field of battle, and in those who survived the hell of war only to return home to live with the hell of wounds received in body and mind. When we appreciate this sacrifice, we understand the second layer of meaning of ANZAC Day, gratitude. In conclusion, we find, for those of us who serve, that the reason that we come for ANZAC Day is in honouring those sacrifices made. We use it as a historical reflection and as a commemorative tradition. Every evening at 6 p.m, in every Return Services Club or Veterans Club in Australia and New Zealand, the music stops. All patrons stand to recite the Ode of Remembrance. The Ode is the fourth stanza of the poem For the Fallen, written by English poet Lawrence Binyon in 1915, and is of special significance on ANZAC Day. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes.
In the Battle of Gallipoli, was it a situation where you said that they had trained for going up a slight slope, sandy beach, and it turned into something else? Is it just the period of time that they didn't have very good reconnaissance, or something else?
Yes. So the question was, in the presentation, I said that the troops landing in Gallipoli went up a much steeper slope than they had expected. Intelligence knew exactly where they were landing. There are some in modern history that say the ANZACs landed in the wrong place. They landed exactly where they were expected. What they couldn't do was replicate these cliffs in their training. So in Australia, in bushland settings where most of the training was done, in New Zealand, in the lowlands was where the initial training was done, and when they went to Egypt they practiced on sand dunes. It was the best that they could get at the time, but it did not prepare them for what they had to face. Yes?
I'm sorry, if I'm correct, didn't a young Winston Churchill, wasn't he involved in the planning of Gallipoli?
Yes, the question was young Winston Churchill involved in the planning? I think his role was that he was in the Department of the Navy at the time, and what, as I understand from my research, he was involved in building the Dardanelles campaign, which including the Navy to move through the Dardanelles. And when that wasn't achieved, then certainly he was one of the architects of the plan to land and cut off the peninsula.
But it stained his reputation, right? Because of the
Yes. Yeah.
Especially in the eyes of the Australians. That's why we hate all Toms. We're together.
Thank you, Fran.
Wait, what did you say?
Is there another question at the back there? Yes.
Uninformed Americans, can you explain the governmental difference between Australia and New Zealand then and today?
Our independence as a nation. Sorry, the question was, can I explain the difference in the government structure of Australia and New Zealand in 1914 to what we have today? As I described on the slide there, being members of the British Commonwealth, again, the major decisions on our external influence in the world was made by the British, and that was what it was like in 1914. Each of these countries sought their independence much later on, and Australia became a fully independent nation in 1975, and and New Zealand in not long after that. Yeah, not long after that, and we then formed our governments to make our decisions. We still retain the position of Governor General, which is the King's representative in both Australia and New Zealand, like many Commonwealth nations do, but it is a titular role. The changing of our Parliament seeks permission from the Governor General, who will never say no. So that is the role. So no longer do we follow exactly what the British Commonwealth asks us to do at times. And we've seen a shift in Australian politics and New Zealand politics, the same as our shift in culture, moving away from the very heavily influence of the British, the love of the royal family, the love of meat and three veg, right through to a change in the 70s and 80s where American culture influenced us a lot more. So major changes there. Does that help?
January 1, 1987.
1987 for New Zealand. Emma.
Okay. Can you answer this is a question after 110 years? This is, I can read it if possible. What were the ANZAC soldiers doing in Çanakkale and Gelibolu, in Çanakkale, in Dardanelles? And wars are usually fought for two main reasons. To defend one's own land or to repel an attack. But in this case, this Gelibolu war or Çanakkale war, neither reason applied. So what was the motivation that brought them from tens of thousands of kilometers away to fight in this war? And thousands of them died there, and also in Turkish people, Turkish soldiers on 250,000 soldiers died too. Why?
It's a great question. Memo was asking. Memo was asking about why the Australian forces would travel 10,000 miles to that area to fight. Such is the life of a soldier, such is the life of a serviceman, that you go where you're told.
Just for protect the British Empire.
So, with the Ottoman Empire involved in the war, the British forces decided that if they could breach the Dardanelles and attack the capital Constantinople, that would be able to turn the Ottoman Empire away from the Central Powers and out of the war. This would allow then the Allied forces to concentrate on Austro-Hungary and the Central Powers in that part of Europe. So that was the plan, was to take them out of the war. And also to protect the British interests through the Suez Canal. So the Australian forces, who for many years after would go where our government thought it was best for us to go. And that meant the majority of our time being away from Australia. The only time that we ever saw service in our country was in 1942 when the Japanese bombed Darwin and some attacks in Sydney Harbour. But that was the only time that we ever had the right to defend ourselves. We are going where our government thinks it's the best to go. And sometimes later in history we find that it wasn't a particularly good reason. But we go where we serve, where we are told to go.
But everybody respect this, all this, you know.
And whilst I've been concentrating on Australia and New Zealand and mentioned the British forces, the French, the Indian who were there, you know, our hearts go out to those Turks who were there defending their country. And as I said earlier, in a town called Esperance, which is just below Perth in Western Australia, on the western part of Australia, this is the town from which most of the transports left to take those soldiers up towards Greece and then further on into Turkey. there is a statue that stands there on the beach overlooking the heads. That statue was provided by Mihail Ataturk, who was the president of
leader of
Turkey, and in it is inscribed, "To the mothers of Australian soldiers who are lost, please don't despair, they are now within the bosom of our country."
Yeah.
So there, as always, this admiration between soldiers of the services who might be at one day attacking one another, but once hostilities are ceased, become friends.
This is friendly war. Yeah, this is incredible.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.